Hi guys, welcome to KF Movie. This time, we're going to talk about a film that portrays the struggles of women in a remote French village in 1851. After all the men in their village are taken away due to a political uprising, the women are left to fight for survival without the support of the men. Then the arrival of a mysterious stranger unexpectedly sparks hope for them to preserve the village's population. Let's dive into the story. This film is set in a mountain village in France in 1851, right in the middle of political turmoil when President Louis Napoleon staged a coup. This coup transformed France from a republic with term limits into an authoritarian empire. The pro-republic men were arrested by Louis Napoleon's soldiers, leaving the women and children helpless, watching and pleading in vain. Among them is Rose, who loses her husband when he is shot for shouting out for democracy. After the tragedy, the women and children gather and agree that they must survive together. They discuss the fate of the men and speculate that most of them will likely be punished as rebels. A young girl named Violet feels uneasy and begins searching for the meaning behind the strange visions she's been having, such as a mysterious predator figure. The village elder suggests that Violet find the meaning on her own, even though they aren't sure of its true significance. In the late afternoon, the women take over the tasks that were once done by the men, including tending the pastures and carrying rifles to stand guard. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire echoes, causing Rose to panic, but the other women remain calm and continue their work. Violet finds Rose on the pasture, crying as she burns her wedding dress. Violet sits beside her, offering comfort and trying to soothe her pain. Violet took some food to Rose and tried to comfort her, encouraging her to recover from her sorrow. The next day, Violet visits the village elder, feeling troubled by the strange visions she's been experiencing lately. She often hallucinates about a predator figure, which piques her curiosity about its meaning. The elder then asks Violet if she has ever cheated on her fiancé. Violet honestly replies that she hasn't. She confesses that since the men, including her fiancé, were taken away, she has felt a profound sense of loss and hopelessness. She has become cold and detached from everything, as if she no longer feels anything. The elder, unable to understand the deeper meaning of Violet's feelings, simply advises her to search for the meaning of her visions herself. In the late afternoon, the women gather to tend to the meadows, taking over the duties once performed by the men. They carry rifles now, prepared to defend themselves if necessary. Suddenly, a gunshot echoes through the air, disrupting the quiet and filling the scene with tension. The women pause, startled, but soon realize that the sound poses no immediate threat. They calmly return to their work, though Rose appears visibly shaken, her trauma from past events stirred by the sudden noise. After working in the meadow, Russ's mother approached Violet and her friends, who were busy milking the sheep. She informed them that she had to leave unexpectedly, despite today being her wedding anniversary. Violet immediately rushed to find her, but couldn't locate her. Eventually, she found Russ's mother in the meadow, where she was burning her wedding dress while sobbing uncontrollably. Violet quickly joined her, offering comfort and companionship during this painful moment. The next morning, while washing clothes, Russ's mother informed the women that her daughter had fallen asleep and was feeling a little better. An older woman named Marion Coley reassured Russ's mother, saying that Russ would likely forget her sorrow in 3 days, so there was no need to worry. Violet immediately disagreed, saying that they would never feel at ease until they knew what had happened to the men out there. Another woman replied that the men must have already been judged, and there was no need to expect anything from them anymore. However, Violet remained determined to find out and urged the women to go down from the mountains to gather information. Many of the younger women agreed with Violet, but Marion stopped them, saying that going to the town would only attract soldiers to the village, which would put the women in danger. She didn't want to see them captured and made slaves by them. Marion's response made several women angry, but they had no choice but to respect the decision of the elders. Driven by curiosity, Violet boldly left the village alone to find out. She passed through the forests, but in the middle of her journey, Violet stopped upon seeing a group of soldiers at the bridge. Violet was forced to turn back and stopped at Lady Owl's house to learn about the situation there. She had left thinking Lady Owl was out, but after a few steps, Violet saw Lady Owl's body hanging, seemingly having taken her own life. Violet quickly ran back to the village and informed the women about the tragic news. A few days later, the women surveyed their wheat fields and agreed that it was time for the harvest. The vast fields made them doubt whether they could finish the harvest on time. Meanwhile, Violet woke up from her sleep and realized she had started her period. All the women, including the children, then gathered together to harvest the wheat. The weather was scorching, and they were not accustomed to such hard labor, to the point that Violet's hands were injured. Eventually, they stopped due to exhaustion. Despite many complaints, they knew they had to endure this difficult situation, as there was still much of the men's work that needed to be completed. To relieve their fatigue, the women decided to take the children to bathe in the river. This way, they could cool off while letting the children have some fun. As the children played in the water, the young women gathered and began to complain about their uncertain futures. For the mothers who already had children, there might still be hope to continue their lives. However, for those who were unmarried, the future seemed bleak if the men did not return. One night, a woman who was deeply depressed went into a frenzy and rang the village bell. She cried, feeling hopeless ever since her husband had left her. The sound of the bell woke all the women in the village, and they quickly gathered at the source of the noise. They tried to calm her down and make her stop. The next day, the young women gathered in the rice field. There, they confessed that they couldn't sleep because they were terrified of being truly alone in this isolated village. One woman suggested that Violet lead the young women to leave the village and build a new life. However, Violet refused, as did Russ, who didn't want to leave her husband's grave. They also wondered what it would be like if all the men on the planet had died, considering no shepherds had passed through their village, as if time had come to a standstill. This question made them smile. Then, one woman said that if they found a single man left on Earth, they would have to share him equally so that everyone could have children. Josephine disagreed with that wild imagination, saying that it went against their concept of monogamy. However, the women actually agreed with the suggestion of sharing the man. Shortly after, an elderly woman suddenly appeared and instructed them to harvest the wheat in the warehouse. The mothers began to feel a little worried about the girls' wild talk. If the men didn't return, they might just run away from the village. The scene then shows Violet while she is sleeping. Here, she is seen touching a sensitive area, indicating that she deeply longs for a partner. While working with her younger brother, Violet talks about their father, whom she remembers as an educated man. Their father often met with the Democratic-Republican Party for discussions, and he used to teach Violet to read and write from a young age. As a result, Violet became the only woman in the village who knows how to read. Here, Violet promises to teach her brother to read, as she believes it is very important. After that, Violet and Rose sit together to knit. Rose opens up again, wishing for another man to come into her life so she can forget Mendy, her late lover, and release her sorrow. Rose longs to relive the first night with her late husband, which she remembers as beautiful. Hearing this, Violet becomes curious and asks what it felt like. Rose replies that the feeling is indescribable. A sudden downpour begins, and Violet notices that the barn where they store the wheat is leaking. She quickly runs out, calling all the women to help repair the roof in the middle of the heavy rain. They work together to repair the roof, even though it's quite risky as they lack experience in handling such situations. After working carefully, they succeed, and fortunately, only a small portion of the wheat is damaged. The women thank Violet for alerting them in time. Spring arrives and Violet begins teaching the children how to read the alphabet. The children appear joyful and enthusiastic. Meanwhile, the women continue harvesting their apple orchard. Everyone works peacefully, each in their own way, until an unfamiliar man suddenly appears and greets them. The man then approaches, while the women stand silently, watching him in surprise. It seems he isn't one of them. Receiving no response, the man walks up to Violet and introduces himself as Jin, a blacksmith. Jin is a traveling worker who currently needs a place to stay. At first, Violet hesitates to respond, feeling unsure in front of the other women. However, after the village elder nods in agreement, Violet welcomes Jin and offers him one of the vacant houses to stay in. On the way to the house, Jin notices the curious looks from the women watching him and feels puzzled. When they reach the village, he asks Violet, "Where are all the men?" Violet replies that she explain tomorrow. Jin shares that he comes from a farm in the valley, working as a day laborer, and usually sleeps in barns or storage sheds. Because of this, he's a bit surprised when Violet says she'd give him a house. Once they arrive, Violet goes to prepare a bed, fruit, and water for him, making Jin feel eager to repay her kindness. He asks if there are any horses or donkeys in the village that need their shoes repaired. Violet responds that there are, but when Jin asks her to call their riders, she falls silent and explains that there are no men in this village. They were all taken away after a coup. Jin then shares news about the conditions in the valley. Louis Napoleon was crowned emperor a few months ago, meaning the French Republic has now become an empire. Many prisoners accused of being Republicans have died or been deported. This news saddens Violet, and she soon takes her leave, though before departing, she mentions that the villagers are in need of extra help. Jin responds by expressing his willingness to assist. Violet quickly goes to meet the women who have gathered, waiting for news. One of the women asks if Jin knows about the condition of the prisoners. However, Violet hides the truth, not wanting to make them sad. She simply replies that she hasn't dared to ask him yet, as they need to first determine whether Jin supports Louis Napoleon or not. From a distance, Violet's mother appears unhappy to see Violet growing close to the stranger. She instructs the women to continue their work. The village elder informs Violet that she is now assigned to look after Jin. Marion helps Violet prepare dinner for Jin. Then, her younger brother runs in and informs her that Jin said he couldn't find any other village besides theirs in the mountains. Upon hearing this, Violet is certain that Jin won't be leaving. She brings the food to Jin's place, and the atmosphere there feels very quiet. Worried that Jin might leave, Violet climbs the stairs to check if Jin is in his room. She feels relieved when she finds him fast asleep, but her curiosity grows when she spots a pistol inside Jin's bag. That night, Jin tidies up his room and is startled to see the women peeking at him from the windows of their houses. Violet, who is also spying from behind a window, feels embarrassed when she realizes that the other women are just as curious about Jin. Realizing this, they quickly rush to close their windows. The next day, the women gather to begin the harvest. Jin arrives and starts by harvesting the wheat, with the women nervously following him from behind. Jin is puzzled by their behavior and begins to realize that the villagers still adhere to traditional concepts where men are highly respected. During the break, they eat together and hear Jin praises the women for their bravery in managing everything on their own, something that is very difficult and impressive. The women feel flattered by Jin's sincere compliment, except for Marion, who sharply says that they don't need such praise. She adds that they are used to working hard without recognition, even before the men were taken. Marion's response creates an awkward atmosphere, but Jin understands their feelings and chooses to continue harvesting the wheat. Touched by her mother's words, Violet later sits alone under a tree. Rose comes over and asks why their mother is often so quick-tempered. Violet replies that her mother misses their father deeply and refuses to betray her loyalty. Rose continues the conversation by mentioning Jin, saying that she feels Violet is well suited to him. However, Violet rejects the compliment, saying that she sees Jin as just an ordinary man. The women continue with their tasks, with Jin eagerly helping. His attitude leads one of the women to scold Marion for her harsh words toward Jin, though in the end, they all agree to keep Jin in the village. The next day, while delivering food, Violet sees Jin reading. Curious, she asks him more about it. Jin, having understood Violet's concerns, explains that he doesn't care about the coup. He is just an ordinary blacksmith, with no permanent home, living a nomadic life. To prove he is merely a traveler, Jin shows his certificate. Violet reads the letter, which surprises Jin, as he didn't realize there was anyone. Violet explains that she is the only one who can read, thanks to the education her father, who was well-educated, provided her. Impressed, Jin hands his book to Violet. She is overjoyed, as this is the first time she has held a book. Jin steps closer while Violet reads, which makes her uneasy, causing her to step back. Before leaving, Jin praises Violet's father for his dedication to the Democratic Republic, which reassures Violet even more that Jin is not a threat to her. At home, Violet spends her time reading. From a distance, her mother, Maria, watches with concern as she notices the change in her daughter's behavior. The next morning, they return to the fields to continue harvesting. Jin observes the women's behavior, noticing how they always try to turn their backs on him, as if they are trying to flirt, but he doesn't pay much attention to it. The women take turns fetching water, deliberately leaving Violet alone with Jin. Violet and Jin talk as they carry the water, sharing their thoughts on the literature they have read. Violet confesses that she has a collection of French literature from her father, but she needs her father's approval before reading it, as the papers are very precious. Jin suggests that she tell him the contents of the literature, and Violet promises that she will do so later. At another time, Rose speaks with Violet, urging her to seduce Jin so that he won't leave the village. Rose reminds her that the women have started to think that Violet might not be able to do it, and they could end up taking Jin for themselves. Hearing this, Violet falls silent, feeling anxious and uneasy. The next morning, Violet notices that Jin is becoming increasingly close to some of the women and is the center of their attention. When delivering food to Jin, Violet begins to recite a poem she has read. Jin is captivated, and the two of them sit facing each other while Violet continues with her poetry. Slowly, Jin begins to touch Violet, who, despite feeling tense, responds to his intimacy. Eventually, the two spend the night together in Jin's room. Violet returns home with mixed feelings, scared because this is her first experience, and she decides to keep their relationship a secret from her mother. The next day, during the harvest, Rose smiles as she looks at Violet, as if understanding that Violet has successfully seduced Jin. The other women begin to gossip. Noticing the closeness between Violet and Jin, some of them feel jealous when they see Violet and Jin walking out together, but Rose defends Violet, thanking her because, thanks to her, Jin might stay longer in the village. That night, Jin reads a poem to Violet about the unending desires of the human heart: love, home, food, and prosperity. He describes the beauty of simple living, making use of the earth's bounty, which he believes would teach people to love their own land. The next morning, while washing clothes, Violet feels the other girls glaring at her, clearly jealous of her happiness. They feel it's unfair that Violet is the one to have the man they all desire. One of the women demands that they uphold the promise made earlier that if a man were to come to the village, they would share him among themselves. Angered by this, Violet challenges them to try and seduce Jin themselves. However, another woman responds sarcastically, saying that they will do so without Violet's permission because, in their eyes, Violet is nothing. Hearing the sharp responses from the other women, who view Jin as their shared right, Violet becomes frustrated and walks away. She continues her work alone in the field. Soon after, Jin approaches her, trying to comfort her and reassuring her that he is loyal to Violet. Violet then confesses that she feels responsible for sharing Jin with the other women in the village, as per their original agreement. Jin, shocked, feels disgusted hearing that the village women see him merely as a means to preserve their lineage. He feels humiliated and decides to leave. In the evening, Violet searches for Jin and finds his lodging room empty. Rose and a few other women approach her, asking why Jin left. Violet explains that she told him about their agreement, which ultimately made him run away. Rose reassures Violet that Jin will surely return. After reading carefully, she's shocked to find an amnesty letter among Jin's documents, indicating that he is a fugitive who received a pardon following Louis Napoleon's coup. This revelation makes Violet realize that Jin is not an ordinary man. The next day, Violet feels relieved when Jin returns as usual. That evening, she brings him food and asks if he's only willing to accept the agreement because he's a fugitive in need of a safe place. Jin, surprised by her question, realizes that Violet must have read his letter. Though he briefly considers leaving, Jin hesitates due to his feelings for Violet and the dangers outside the village. Meanwhile, Violet confides in Rose at the church, expressing guilt over their decision regarding Jin. Days pass and the women grow increasingly flirtatious with Jin. Frustrated, Violet goes to the river to bathe and calm herself, unaware that Jin has followed her. They talk and Jin reassures Violet that he will never leave her. The next day, Jin helps Violet and her friends with the wheat harvest. During their work, another woman flirts with Jin, and though Violet notices, she chooses to ignore it, letting the moment pass. One of the women approached Jin and forced him to fulfill their agreement. Jin reluctantly went along with it, but his feelings became increasingly conflicted. Violet, seeing Jin with another woman, felt jealous and immediately confronted him. Jin honestly said that he had fulfilled the women's desires, though Violet appeared hurt. That night, Violet had a nightmare, seeing an owl devouring a mouse, a dark omen that made her realize her true feelings. She went to Jin and confessed her love, admitting that she was afraid of losing him. The next day, in the field, Violet saw her sister being mistreated by one of the village women, who forced her to do something inappropriate. Violet immediately took action to protect her sister. After that, Violet visited Rose at her husband's grave, where she heard Rose express her desire to have a child with Jin. Rose assured Violet that this was part of the original agreement, though she never intended to hurt Violet's feelings. The next day, Violet brought food for Jin and asked him to be honest about his past. Jin finally opened up, telling her that he had once shot a man in self-defense, and if the government caught him, he would be sentenced to death. He shared how his journey as a fugitive had brought him to this village and led him to Violet, admitting that if it weren't for her, he would have left long ago. Hearing this, Violet smiled, feeling relieved and touched by Jin's feelings. As the days passed, one day the village elder announced that Violet was pregnant. Overjoyed, Violet couldn't wait to share the news with Jin. Their bond grew stronger, and although Jin continued to spend time with other women in the village, they also began to show signs of pregnancy. One day, an unexpected event occurred when two men suddenly appeared in the village. All the women gathered around, and one of the men was Yudin, a resident who had been missing for a long time. He arrived with a foreign man who had accompanied him throughout his journey. Yudin informed them that most of the men from their village had been deported to Algeria, while others had disappeared or died due to violence. Only a few men, including himself and two others, had managed to be released, one of whom was Rose's father. Some of the women rejoiced upon hearing that their families were safe, but for others, the news brought deep sorrow, including Violet, who realized that her father might never return. The presence of Yudin and his disapproving expression made Jin uneasy. He began to consider leaving for his own safety. Violet and Rose approached the village elders, worried about the reaction of the men returning if they found out the truth about the children the village women were carrying. The village elders advised them to keep everything that happened with Jin a secret, to maintain peace in the village and protect their children. Meanwhile, Jin was advised to leave as soon as possible to avoid escalating the situation. However, Violet disagreed with this decision. If Jin had to leave, she wanted to go with him. She truly loved him. On the other hand, Jin felt that he had become a source of trouble in the village and didn't want to add more pressure on Violet or the other women. That night, Violet packed her belongings, determined to escape with Jin. However, when she arrived at the inn, she found only an empty room with a note from Jin. In the letter, Jin explained that although he loved Violet, he had to leave for the sake of their future. He hoped that Violet and the village would find peace again. With a heavy heart, Violet accepted Jin's departure. In the final scenes, it was shown that Violet gave birth to her baby safely. Her face radiated happiness, symbolizing the peace that had returned to the village, as long as they could keep the secret about Jin. And with that, the film came to an end.